What if the fear you wake up with isn't yours? What if your anxiety didn't start with your childhood, but with your grandmother's silence, your grandfather's buried grief, or an ancestor whose name you've never heard, but whose pain still echoes through your bloodstream? Modern science now confirms something ancient traditions have long intuited. Trauma can be passed down through your DNA. It's not metaphor, it's mechanism. Your body is not only your own, it is a living archive of unresolved stories, coded in proteins, embedded in neurons, and whispered through unconscious patterns you never agreed to, but have always lived inside of. In the next few minutes, you're not just going to learn about trauma. You're going to see yourself in a mirror you didn't know existed. Let me tell you a story. A child, only 8 years old, begins to suffer from inexplicable panic attacks. No apparent cause, no direct trauma, no abuse. Loving parents. That her brother, the child's great-uncle, died tragically in a drowning accident at the age of 8. No one had ever talked about it. It was too painful, too heavy, so it was buried. But the child had been carrying it, biologically, emotionally, energetically. The pain hadn't disappeared, it had transferred. This is not an isolated case. This is a pattern, a phenomenon, a legacy, and it affects more of us than we realize. In this video, we will explore how trauma is not only emotional but informational. You'll discover how science, psychology, and spirituality are converging to explain the invisible patterns you were born into. You'll learn how trauma is stored in the nervous system, passed through epigenetic markers, repeated through subconscious loyalty, and how you can become the first in your lineage to stop the cycle. Because yes, you may be the first to feel the pain, but you are not the first to carry it, and that realization may be the beginning of your freedom. What is intergenerational trauma? The hidden code of family. Pain. You weren't born blank. You were born into a story already in motion. You entered a world shaped by the unresolved emotions of those who came before you. You arrived carrying not only your soul, but a psychic and biological inheritance encoded in gestures, glances, fears, expectations, and unspoken rules. That legacy has a name: intergenerational trauma. It's the hidden program running in the background of your life, influencing the way you love, react, protect, and even self-destruct, often without your awareness. This is not metaphorical. It's memory encoded in biology, experience, and environment. You may think your triggers began with you. They didn't. What you call anxiety may be the echo of your mother's suppressed panic. What you call self-sabotage may be the shadow of your grandfather's shame. What you call your personality may actually be your survival strategy. Intergenerational trauma is the transmission of emotional wounds, unresolved pain, and unprocessed stress across generations. It's not just passed through parenting styles or stories told at the dinner table. It's passed through silence, through absence, through the tense shoulders of a mother who never felt safe, through the rigid silence of a father who was taught that emotions were weakness. It can be passed through epigenetic markers, yes, but it also travels through tone of voice, through eye contact, through what is allowed to be expressed and what is punished. It seeps into your system before you even have language to question it. You learn what love feels like, not through words, but through nervous system signals. And those signals may be distorted by generations of survival, grief, abandonment, or loss. If your great-grandmother had to harden herself to endure war, if your grandfather drowned his sorrow in alcohol and silence, if your parents were taught to suppress instead of process, then what you inherited was not just a lineage of faces and names, but a psychic field charged with unresolved emotional codes. You were born inside a web of patterns seeking resolution. Not because you are weak or broken, but because you are sensitive enough to feel what others refuse to. Often, those who carry intergenerational trauma are the most empathic members of the family system. The ones who feel more, suffer more, internalize more, not because they are unstable, but because they are open. The sensitive child often becomes the emotional carrier of the unhealed wounds of the lineage. And yet, these patterns remain invisible for most of our lives because we normalize them. We say, this is just how my family is. This is just who I am. This is just how love works. Until something breaks. A symptom appears. A relationship collapses. A panic attack comes out of nowhere. And in that moment, the deeper truth starts to emerge. That maybe the story you've been living isn't actually yours. Maybe it was handed to you. Intergenerational trauma can appear as chronic anxiety, depression, hyperindependence, emotional shutdown, addiction, or repeated failure in love and money. It can manifest in the same age your father lost everything, in the same month your grandmother was institutionalized, in the same town where no one ever talks about what happened. It repeats in symptoms that defy explanation, patterns that feel fated, and feelings that never seem to belong entirely to you. That's the hidden intelligence of trauma. It seeks visibility through repetition, and it will continue to repeat until someone is willing to see it, name it, feel it, and give it a place. But this is not about blame. It's about awareness. No one chose to pass this pain down. Everyone was doing their best with the tools they had. Intergenerational trauma is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that something was too heavy to carry, and it had to go somewhere. You are not being punished. You are being asked to wake up, because the patterns that live in you are not your fault, but they are now your responsibility. You may be the first in your family to have the emotional vocabulary to name what was never spoken. You may be the first to seek therapy, to sit in stillness, to question the rules, to trace the pain back to its origin. And in doing so, you're not just healing yourself. You're creating a break in the pattern, a shift in the entire system. You are becoming the turning point. And that's why understanding intergenerational trauma matters. Because when you finally see the code, you can begin to rewrite it. Because when you realize that the fear, the shame, the sadness, that they didn't begin with you, something cracks open. Compassion, clarity, choice. You become the one who transforms the inheritance. And it starts by looking not just at your emotions, but at your biology. Epigenetics of trauma. How emotional pain is passed down through DNA. There is a profound difference between what you inherit genetically and what you inherit epigenetically. One gives you your eye color. The other might give you your great-grandmother's silent grief. For years, we thought that DNA was destiny, that you are the sum total of your genetic code, as fixed and unmoving as stone. But today, the science of epigenetics reveals something very different and far more liberating. It tells us that the way your genes express themselves is not rigid. It's responsive, and that response is shaped by environment, emotion, and even trauma. Epigenetics is the study of how gene activity is turned on or off, enhanced or silenced, without altering the underlying DNA sequence. Like a musical score, the notes remain the same, but the interpretation, the tempo, the volume, the pauses, that's where the music changes. And that's where trauma leaves its mark. When a person experiences a life-threatening event, war, abuse, loss, displacement, the body doesn't just react in the moment, it adapts. Survival requires change. Hormonal systems recalibrate. The immune response adjusts. Neurological circuits harden or collapse. The body encodes a lesson. This world is not safe. That coding gets written not just into the person's psyche, but into the chemical tags that sit atop their genes. This process, known as DNA methylation, acts like a dimmer switch for gene expression. Some genes get silenced, others get amplified. And here's where the breakthrough comes. Those epigenetic changes can be passed down through generations. The trauma doesn't just live in memory, it lives in molecular behavior, and it doesn't die with the person. It transmits. This has been shown in multiple scientific studies. The descendants of Holocaust survivors, for example, show altered cortisol levels and distinct methylation patterns in genes related to stress regulation, despite never having lived through the events themselves. Children born to mothers who survived the Dutch hunger winter of 1944 carry metabolic gene modifications linked to famine adaptation, even if they were born decades later in times of abundance. In rodent studies, researchers have trained male mice to associate the smell of cherry blossom with electric shocks. Their offspring, who never experienced the shock, still displayed intense fear responses to the scent. Through sperm alone, The memory of terror had been transmitted. This is not mythology. This is measurable. It is the science of remembrance. You may be carrying echoes of your ancestors' heartbreak in the way your body responds to intimacy, in the way you contract in moments of success, in the way you panic when things are too quiet. These reactions are not always based on your life's events. They may be inherited warning signals from generations that never had the safety to process their pain. The world changed, the danger passed, but the coding remained. That's why intergenerational trauma is so difficult to trace, because it doesn't live in your conscious mind. It lives in your cells, in your neurobiology, in your automatic behaviors, and unless brought into awareness, it continues its silent transmission, not because it's punishing you, but because it's protecting you. At least it believes it is. But here is where epigenetics becomes more than a diagnosis. It becomes a doorway. Because if your biology is responsive to trauma, it is also responsive to healing. Just as fear imprints epigenetic markers, so does safety. So does presence. So does connection. Meditation, breathwork, emotional integration, loving relationships, all have the power to influence how your genes express. That means your healing doesn't just benefit you. It alters the code for those who come after. You are not a passive recipient of suffering. You are an active participant in an evolutionary leap, the shift from unconscious inheritance to conscious transformation. The body is not a prison of the past. It's a canvas, a place where new expressions can emerge. This is why understanding the epigenetics of trauma matters. It empowers you to see your symptoms not as flaws, but as messages. It invites you to ask, what is my body trying to protect me from? And more importantly, is that threat still real? Because the trauma you carry may have once served survival, but now it may be standing in the way of your freedom. And when you begin to answer that question, your biology responds, not as a slave to history, but as a living testament to resilience, because the same code that inherited the pain can be rewritten by your awareness. Neuroscience of inherited trauma. How the brain stores what the mind can't remember. Your brain is not a machine, it's an ecosystem, and every ecosystem responds to the conditions it's been exposed to, even if those conditions came long before you were born. While epigenetics explains how trauma is biologically inherited, neuroscience shows us how it's stored, activated, and perpetuated. The brain doesn't simply remember trauma, it reshapes itself around it, and that reshaping can be passed through generations in both structure and behavior. Which means what you're experiencing as anxiety or hypervigilance may not be the result of your personality or even your life circumstances. It might be the echo of a nervous system trained by the past to expect danger, even in the absence of threat. When a traumatic event occurs, whether a single acute shock or a prolonged series of stressors, the brain shifts into survival mode. The amygdala, the brain's alarm center, becomes hyperactive. It scans the environment for danger and initiates a flood of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones increase heart rate, constrict muscles, and prepare the body to flee, freeze, or fight. It's brilliant. It's protective. And when the trauma passes, the system is supposed to reset. But when the trauma doesn't get resolved, or when it's so overwhelming that the system never gets the chance to discharge, the nervous system remains stuck in high alert. The amygdala keeps firing. The hippocampus, which stores memories and gives them context in time and space, becomes impaired. It can no longer clearly categorize the trauma as something that happened in the past. Instead, the brain stores fragments, images, sensations, without chronology. This is why trauma doesn't return as a story. It returns as a reaction, a flash, a tightening, a shutdown, a scream inside the body that no one else can hear. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic, empathy, and self-regulation, becomes weakened under chronic stress. This is the part of the brain you rely on to assess whether you're safe. When it goes offline, the emotional brain takes over. You're no longer responding to the present. You're reliving the past. Now imagine these patterns being repeated, not just in you, but in your parents, in your grandparents, in generations shaped by war, famine, loss, displacement, or silence. Their brains adjusted to survive, and their behaviors, emotional styles, and coping mechanisms became your blueprint for normal. A child growing up with a parent whose nervous system is dysregulated will internalize those signals. If the parent is emotionally shut down, the child may interpret connection as unsafe. If the parent is unpredictable or anxious, the child's brain learns to scan constantly for cues. This isn't psychology, it's neurobiology through entrainment. The developing brain adapts to the emotional landscape it's immersed in. Even without direct trauma, the child absorbs the inherited activation of a system that never fully healed. These adaptations shape core beliefs, emotional thresholds, and somatic responses. Over time, they solidify into what we call identity. But much of what we think is who we are is actually who we had to become in order to stay connected, safe, or invisible in our family system. This is how trauma gets passed down not just through stories or DNA, but through neural wiring. And because much of this is implicit, meaning it happens beneath conscious awareness, it's incredibly persistent. You may not remember what happened to your ancestors, but your body might. Chronic muscle tension, difficulty trusting others, fear of expression, hyper-independence, emotional reactivity, shutdown. These are often not just responses to what's happening now, but echoes of what happened long before. The brain and body are trying to protect you from threats that may no longer exist, but the system never got the message. The good news is that the brain is not static, it's plastic. Neuroplasticity means you can form new neural pathways through repeated experiences of safety, regulation, and connection. Practices like mindfulness, breathwork, somatic therapy, EMDR, safe relationship dynamics, and trauma-informed meditation all create conditions where the nervous system can reset, where the brain can relearn that the present is not the past, that it's finally safe to feel. And when your brain changes, your life changes. You no longer react to a tone of voice as if it's war. You no longer leave love before it leaves you. You no longer collapse when you make a mistake. Instead, you meet the moment as it is, not as your body fears it might be. That's not just healing, that's liberation. And when you liberate your brain, you don't just set yourself free, you shift what's possible for the next generation. Because when the nervous system becomes coherent, the transmission of trauma begins to end. Which brings us to the next layer, not in your brain or cells, but in the emotional architecture of your family line. What if the trauma you carry is part of a pattern that has been cycling for generations, waiting for someone like you to notice? Family patterns and emotional inheritance, psychogenealogy, and generational pain. You may be trying to fix something in your life that isn't broken. It's just repeating. That's the silent force of family patterns. They are not merely stories or habits. They are energetic blueprints carried across generations. And unless we make them conscious, we live them as if they were ours, rewriting the same script under new names in new cities with different people. But the roles remain the same. The pain remains the same. The lesson remains unfinished. That's where the science and wisdom of psychogenealogy begins. Psychogenealogy is the study of how ancestral experiences shape the psyche of descendants. It's not a theory, it's a mirror. It reveals how symptoms like depression, addiction, infertility, financial chaos, or repeated relationship collapse are often not personal pathologies. They're systemic echoes. They belong to the family soul, not just the individual. French psychotherapist Anne-Ancelin Schutzenberger mapped this terrain by studying emotional patterns across multiple generations of patients. What she found was uncanny. People kept reliving the unresolved traumas of their ancestors, often on the same dates at the same ages, through the same types of crises. She called it the anniversary syndrome. A woman miscarries at the same age her grandmother lost a child. A man suffers a nervous breakdown at the age his father was imprisoned. A teenager attempts suicide on the exact day her uncle died, the story no one ever told her. These repetitions are not random. They are calls for recognition, because what the system excludes, the body includes. What the mind forgets, the heart remembers. What one generation cannot feel, the next will embody. It doesn't matter if the event happened 70 years ago. if the grief was never integrated, the rage never expressed, the loss never mourned, that energy doesn't vanish. It waits, not as a ghost, but as a code, a survival instruction seeking resolution. We inherit more than eye color or blood type. We inherit roles. The caretaker, the scapegoat, the invisible one, the overachiever, the sacrificial child. And these roles are often assigned by unconscious family dynamics that seek balance, not fairness, but survival. If a grandfather was cast out or betrayed, a grandson may unconsciously sabotage his own success to remain loyal to that exclusion. If a woman's mother suffered in marriage, she may unconsciously reject intimacy to avoid betrayal. If an ancestor lost everything due to ambition, a descendant may develop a fear of visibility or abundance. The pattern isn't logical, it's emotional, and it moves through silence. This is why family secrets are never truly secret. They live in the gaps, the things not talked about, the names not mentioned, the shame no one dares touch. And yet, that silence becomes loud in the bodies and lives of the next generation, because energy always seeks expression. And the unconscious will repeat what was suppressed until someone chooses to see it. This is the work of the genogram, a map of your family's emotional history, not just births, deaths, and marriages, but trauma events, illnesses, migrations, addictions, abortions, betrayals, suicides, accidents. When you lay out 3 or more generations, you begin to see something, the story behind your story, the inherited loyalty, the unconscious contract, the pain that isn't yours, but that you've been carrying out of love. Because that's what this really is, a distorted expression of love. A child saying, "I'll carry this for you. I won't be happier than you were. I'll fail like you did, so you're not alone." This is not weakness, this is devotion. But devotion without consciousness becomes repetition without transformation. The moment you see the pattern is the moment you are no longer inside it, blindly. You can choose. You can grieve what wasn't yours to carry. You can return what never belonged to you. You can say to your ancestors, "I honor your pain. I remember your story, but I will no longer live it out in my own." That sentence alone can break a cycle. And when you speak what was silenced, you become the voice of generations. You give form to the formless. You bring light to what was hidden. You take your place in the lineage, not as a carrier of pain, but as an agent of transformation. This is how inherited trauma begins to release. Not through blame, but through witnessing. Not by disowning your roots, but by untying yourself from their suffering. Because the family tree doesn't just pass down what's unresolved, it also passes down the power to resolve it. Invisible loyalties, systemic psychology, and transgenerational trauma. You may think you're making your own choices, but in the depths of the unconscious, you might be living out an agreement you never consciously made. Systemic psychology reveals a truth that most of us sense but cannot explain. Sometimes, what feels like self-sabotage is actually love in disguise. A love so deep, so blind, so loyal, that we'd rather suffer than separate from the emotional field of those who came before us. These are the invisible loyalties, unconscious bonds to our family system that can override logic, desire, even freedom itself. Bert Hellinger, the father of family constellations, called this the family soul. He observed that every family system operates like a field of belonging, and within that field, certain laws are at play, laws of order, inclusion, balance. When these laws are disrupted, when someone is excluded, when a death is denied, when a secret is buried, when guilt is never acknowledged, the system doesn't forget. It compensates. The emotional debt is not erased, it is reassigned. That reassignment happens through what Hellinger called entanglement. A descendant unconsciously takes on the fate, the pain, or the behavior of someone who was cast out, shamed, or forgotten. Not as punishment, as a way to restore belonging. As if to say, "I will suffer like you so you are not alone. I will carry your guilt so you are remembered. I will fail in love so you are included in mine." The unconscious mind equates loyalty with repetition. This is why children often reenact the pain of previous generations without knowing anything about their stories. A young woman develops a fear of commitment, not knowing that her great-aunt died of heartbreak after being abandoned at the altar. A man loses everything in business, not realizing his grandfather was financially ruined and took his own life. A child grows up depressed, never told that their mother had a twin who died at birth. The living echo the lives of the unremembered, because the family soul wants no one left behind. Systemic psychology teaches that every member of the family has a right to belong, even the ones who were lost, rejected, or shamed. When someone is excluded, their energy doesn't disappear. It becomes a blind spot, and that blind spot seeks healing through someone else's life. Often, the most sensitive, empathic person in the family is the one who carries the most hidden burdens. They feel the weight of something they cannot name, and for years believe that something is wrong with them. But nothing is wrong, they are entangled. This is not something you think your way out of. You feel it in your body. You sense it in the way you shrink when you succeed, in the way you abandon yourself to stay close to others, in the way you sabotage joy because joy was dangerous in your house. And yet, these patterns only exist because love was distorted, not lost. Because someone in your ancestry gave up too much, and now the system wants balance. Because someone never had a voice, and now you are the one who trembles every time you try to speak. But awareness interrupts the trance. When you see that your suffering is not a flaw but a message from the field, everything changes. You begin to understand that loyalty can be redefined. You don't have to carry the pain to stay connected. You can include the past without becoming it. You can honor what happened without repeating it. You can say to the ones who came before, I see you, I carry your story in my heart, but I will walk my own path now. And in doing so, you bring healing not only to yourself, but to the whole system. This is the essence of systemic healing. Not to fix the past, but to give it a place. Not to erase the pain, but to stop the inheritance of it. When the excluded are remembered, the system can settle. When the denied is acknowledged, the flow of life can resume. You stop carrying what isn't yours. You return to your rightful place, not as the rescuer of your family, but as a free, sovereign soul. And once you see the system, you can begin to work with it. To ritualize your release, to express what was never spoken, to move the energy that was frozen for generations. That is what we'll explore next. The practical ways you can begin to untangle these loyalties, rewrite inherited codes, and become the one who breaks the cycle, not by rejecting the family, but by transforming the information it gave you. How to heal family trauma. Practical tools for emotional and epigenetic release. Healing family trauma is not about blaming anyone. It's not about exposing wounds to punish the past. It's about bringing light to what was hidden, movement to what was stuck, and awareness to what was unconscious. When we understand that trauma isn't just emotional, but informational, the way we approach healing must also change. We're not just regulating emotions. We're rewriting the inherited programs that live in our cells, our nervous system, our behavior, and our beliefs. One of the most powerful tools to begin this process is the genogram. Unlike a family tree which lists names and dates, the genogram maps emotional patterns, traumas, and significant life events over at least 3 generations. As you build it, you might begin to notice strange repetitions, miscarriages at the same age, addictions that skip generations, marriage breakdowns following the same timeline. These are not coincidences, they are clues. The genogram reveals the architecture of your inherited pain. And once you see the pattern, you are no longer inside it blindly. But insight is not enough. Healing requires expression, especially of the things that were silenced. That's where therapeutic writing becomes essential. Take a journal and write letters you will never send, to your parents, to ancestors you never met, to the parts of you that are still entangled in someone else's story. Say everything, especially the things you were never allowed to say. This is not just catharsis. Neuroscience shows that emotional labeling and expression activate the prefrontal cortex, helping regulate the amygdala, the part of the brain that stores trauma. What you put into words, you begin to integrate. But some traumas are stored deeper, not just in thoughts but in the body. That's why talk therapy alone often fails to reach inherited wounds. They are somatic, encoded in the nervous system. Practices like somatic experiencing, breathwork, trauma-informed yoga, and embodied meditation allow you to discharge the survival energy still trapped in your tissues. When you tremble, sweat, cry, or feel waves of sensation move through your body, it's not regression, it's release. The body is finally completing a cycle that was interrupted, maybe decades ago, maybe before you were even born. Another key approach is family constellation work, which can be done in group or individual sessions. In this process, participants represent members of your family system, and what unfolds is often shocking. Emotions rise, roles shift, hidden dynamics come to light. It might seem mystical, but it's based on the systemic principle that the family unconscious behaves like a field of information that can be accessed, revealed, and reorganized. When the excluded are acknowledged, when the forgotten are given a place, when the truth is named, healing ripples through the lineage. The nervous system of the entire family field relaxes, but healing also requires repetition. You can't untangle a lifetime of inherited patterns in one breakthrough. This is where neuroplasticity comes in, the brain's ability to rewire itself through consistent attention and new experiences. Every time you choose presence over reaction, compassion over projection, truth over avoidance, you are editing your genetic story. The brain changes, the body changes, the field changes. You become the conscious author of what you pass forward. Symbols and rituals help anchor these changes, lighting a candle for an ancestor who was never mourned, placing a photo on an altar, saying, "Thank you, I'll take the love, not the pain." These small acts are massive in the symbolic language of the unconscious. They tell your system, we are safe now, we are allowed to move forward. The nervous system hears it, the cells respond. Lastly, silence. Deep, intentional silence. Not the silence of suppression, but of listening. Sit with the stillness. Let the stories rise. Ask your body what it has carried. Wait for the answer, because healing family trauma is not a straight line. It's a spiral, returning again and again to the same places, but with more clarity, more love, and more choice. You are not just healing for yourself. You are healing for everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. You are the break in the chain, becoming the conscious ancestor. You were not chosen because you're broken. You were chosen because you're ready to see what others couldn't, feel what others buried, and speak what others were forced to silence. In every lineage there comes one, a sensitive, intuitive, sometimes misunderstood soul, who wakes up in the middle of the inherited storm and says, "This ends with me." That one is not a victim. That one is a turning point. That one is you. Being the first to see the pattern is painful. The others didn't notice it or couldn't afford to. They were too busy surviving, adapting, keeping the system together. But you noticed the repetition, the way love came with fear, the way shame passed like a family recipe, the way silence wrapped around truths too heavy to speak. You noticed, and for a time, you felt alone in it. But what you didn't know is that your awareness was already the first fracture in the cycle. Consciousness cracks the script. When you become aware of an inherited trauma, you don't just change your own life, you alter the field that shaped you. You become what epigenetic scientists are beginning to call a transmitter of recalibration. The stress responses that once prepared your ancestors for war can now become calm. The beliefs that once kept them alive can now become expansive. Your nervous system becomes a place where old pain meets new possibility. You're not just breaking a chain, you're alchemizing it. This role comes with grief, ancestral grief that flows through your body like a river that was dammed for too long. You may find yourself weeping without knowing why, waking with sorrow in your bones. Mourning stories you never lived. That is not depression, that is release. That is the nervous system discharging a century's worth of suppression. Let it move, let it tremble, let it breathe through you until it becomes light again. Because when pain is witnessed, it transforms. And then comes the shift, when you begin to see your family not as wrong, not as flawed, but as human. When you stop expecting them to understand your healing. When you forgive without condoning, love without losing yourself, and honor without obeying pain. That is the moment you step out of reaction and into creation. That is when you become the conscious ancestor. You stop asking, "Why me?" and start saying, "Now me. Now I choose. Now I respond, not react. Now I hold the line differently. Now I pass on peace." Because lineage is not just what you inherit, it's what you continue. And at any moment, you can choose to continue something else. You can speak what was never spoken. You can love where there was resentment. You can build where there was destruction. You can choose presence where there was absence. That choice sends a signal through your biology, through your brain, through the emotional field that surrounds you, and it says, the pattern stops here. You become the one your descendants will feel, even if they never meet you. The calm in their blood, the resilience in their spine, the strange, powerful sense that someone somewhere once chose a different way, that someone remembered what love without pain feels like, and because of that, they are free. This is not a burden, it's a blessing. It's not about carrying more, it's about carrying differently. With awareness, with clarity, with strength that doesn't come from armor but from softness. The softness of a heart that stayed open through it all. So if you've ever felt like you don't belong, maybe it's because you were born to make something new belong. If you've ever felt like you carry too much, maybe it's because you're strong enough to transmute it. And if you've ever felt like your story started before you were born, maybe now is the time you start writing the next chapter. One not dictated by trauma, but by truth. And you won't do it alone. As you heal, you awaken the healing potential in every direction. Backward, forward, and outward, into the collective field. And that's where we're going next. Beyond the personal, beyond the family, into the realm of collective trauma, where social pain becomes structure, and your healing becomes revolution. Social trauma as inherited structure, breaking collective programs. Some of the pain you carry isn't personal, it's cultural. It didn't start in your childhood or your bloodline. It was encoded long before that, inside the architecture of your society, your nation, your gender, your race. Before you had a name, before your parents were born, you were already breathing in the unresolved grief of entire civilizations. And until now, you probably thought it was yours. Trauma is not just psychological, it's not even just familial, it's structural. Embedded in laws, beliefs, systems, institutions, and norms so ancient, we stop noticing them. But they shape us. They tell us what is normal, who belongs, who matters, what love looks like, what power sounds like. They tell us what to suppress, what to tolerate, and what to be ashamed of, all while we think we're just being human. Generational programming doesn't stop at the family level. It expands outward into entire groups, people marked by shared histories of war, exile, slavery, colonization, genocide, famine, or silence. These events don't disappear with time. They leave somatic imprints, passed down through the same epigenetic and nervous system mechanisms that carry individual trauma. A grandchild of a Holocaust survivor may carry a silent dread of being hunted. A descendant of enslaved people may carry inherited hypervigilance. The child of a colonized people may inherit internalized inferiority, even if they grow up free. This is not about victimhood, it's about recognition. Because the moment we see that these patterns are not individual failings, but collective inheritances, we begin to reclaim our power. We stop blaming ourselves for wounds that belong to larger forces, and in doing so, we take responsibility for changing those forces. It's not just our families that we must heal from, it's the systems they were shaped within. Patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, religious trauma, authoritarian regimes. These structures didn't just hurt individuals, they shaped entire lineages of behavior and belief. They taught generations to disconnect from the body, from intuition, from joy, from the right to rest or say no or speak truth. And we call that culture. But culture, too, can be rewritten. To break these collective programs, we must first become aware of the invisible contracts we've signed, the inherited scripts that say, stay small, don't be too much, don't trust others, you must work to deserve love. It's dangerous to speak out. These are not just personal thoughts, they are societal echoes looping in the background of entire communities. And once you recognize them, you can begin to break them, not just by resisting them, but by embodying something different. You embody something different when you rest without guilt, when you take up space without apology, when you speak truth even when it shakes, when you create without permission, when you laugh, love, cry, and rise in ways your ancestors never could. That's not rebellion, that's liberation. That's how collective trauma begins to dissolve, not through systems changing first, but through nervous systems healing from within. There is a term for this kind of work: ancestral activism. It's the understanding that every act of healing yourself is also an act of transforming the cultural field. Every time you unlearn scarcity, you break a code of colonization. Every time you feel joy in your body, you repair centuries of disembodiment. Every time you forgive, and not to forget but to free, you rewrite the story your lineage was trapped in. And as more of us do this, not from ego but from remembrance, we start to weave a new field, one where trauma is no longer normalized, where silence is no longer survival, where our children inherit more than just resilience, they inherit permission to be whole. So no, the pain didn't start with you, but the healing can. And in doing so, you're not just breaking cycles, you're building new ones, you're creating a future where information becomes wisdom, not wound, where memory becomes medicine, and where what was once passed down in fear is now passed forward in love.